the Pacific Ocean, May 1942. The morning sun breaks through scattered clouds, casting long shadows across the flight deck of the USS Yorktown as she limps toward Pearl Harbor. Her hull bears the scars of battle, deep gashes torn through steel plating by enemy ordnance. Below decks, seawater sloshes through compartments that should be bone dry. The carrier lists slightly to port, her crew exhausted, their faces smudged with oil and smoke, residue from the Battle of the Coral Sea. Among the hundreds of sailors aboard, one man stands at the edge of what many believe is an impossible task. His name is lost to most historical records, just another welder in the Navy's vast machinery of war. But in the coming days, his hands, his skill, and his unconventional approach will mean the difference between victory and defeat in the most crucial naval battle of the Pacific War. This is the story of how one man's ugly repair saved an aircraft carrier, changed the course of a battle, and helped turn the tide of World War II. The USS Yorktown had earned her battle scars honestly. In the Coral Sea, she had faced the full fury of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Enemy dive bombers had screamed down from the clouds, their pilots determined, their aim deadly accurate. One bomb had penetrated deep into the carrier's interior, the explosion tearing through multiple decks. The blast had created a crater-like wound in her hull below the waterline. Another hit had started fires that raged through her engineering spaces. The ship's crew had fought desperately to save her, but the damage was severe, catastrophic by any reasonable standard. As Yorktown steamed toward Pearl Harbor, her captain faced a grim reality. Standard repair procedures would take months. The Navy's best estimate suggested 3 months minimum in dry dock, possibly longer. They would need to cut away damaged sections, fabricate new plating, install complex systems, test everything. It was methodical, thorough, proper. It was also time the United States Navy did not have. Intelligence reports were flooding into Pacific Fleet headquarters. The Japanese were planning something big. Code breakers working around the clock had intercepted and decrypted enemy communications. An operation was coming, something massive, targeting an island called Midway. The tiny atoll, barely a speck in the vast Pacific, would become the focal point of Japanese offensive power. They were sending their entire carrier fleet, their most experienced pilots, their best commanders. It would be the largest naval operation since Pearl Harbor, and the United States had exactly 3 operational aircraft carriers in the entire Pacific to stop them. One of those carriers needed to be Yorktown. There was no alternative, no backup plan. Enterprise and Hornet would fight, but against 4 Japanese carriers, they needed every flight deck, every aircraft, every advantage they could muster. Yorktown had to sail. Yorktown had to fight. When the carrier entered Pearl Harbor on May 27th, observers on other ships shook their heads in dismay. The damage was worse than anyone had imagined. The list was visible from miles away. Oil leaked from her hull, creating rainbow patterns on the harbor's surface. Her flight deck bore scorch marks and buckled plating. Below decks, the situation was even worse. The bomb that had penetrated her interior had created structural damage that naval architects said would require cutting away entire sections of the ship. Admiral Chester Nimitz came aboard personally. He walked through the damaged sections, his face grave. He listened to the repair estimates. 3 months, 90 days. By then, Midway would be lost. The strategic initiative would belong to Japan, and the war in the Pacific would take on a completely different character. Nimitz asked a question that seemed impossible. Could they do it in 3 days? The silence that followed was profound. 3 days, 72 hours to accomplish what should take 90 days. It wasn't just ambitious. It seemed, to most of the engineers present, absolutely impossible. But this was war, and impossible had become a requirement. What happened next was one of the most remarkable repair efforts in naval history. The Navy called in every available worker from Pearl Harbor's shipyards. They summoned welders, electricians, carpenters, metal workers, anyone with skills relevant to ship repair. Work gangs swarmed aboard Yorktown like ants on a fallen tree. They worked in shifts around the clock. Welding torches blazed day and night. The sounds of hammers, saws, and grinding metal created a constant din that echoed across the harbor. But one section of damage presented a problem that seemed to defy every solution they proposed. The bomb hit below the waterline had created a massive wound in the hull. It wasn't just a hole. The explosion had bent and twisted the surrounding steel, creating a complex three-dimensional puzzle of torn metal. Standard repair procedures called for cutting away all damaged sections and replacing them with new plating, properly fitted, properly welded, properly tested. They didn't have time for proper. A senior welder examined the damage, and what he saw made his heart sink. The hull plating had been torn away, exposing internal compartments to the sea. The edges of the wound were ragged, bent inward in some places, blown outward in others. Structural members behind the outer hull had been damaged or destroyed. Fuel lines ran near the damaged area. Electrical conduits had been severed. It was a nightmare of destruction, and he had perhaps 18 hours to fix it before Yorktown needed to be underway. He gathered his team, a group of welders who had been working without sleep for nearly 2 days already. Their eyes were red-rimmed, their hands steady despite exhaustion. They understood what was at stake. Every man in Pearl Harbor understood. Midway was coming. Yorktown had to sail. The welder in charge, our anonymous hero, made a decision that would horrify naval architects and save an aircraft carrier. He looked at the damage and realized that perfect was the enemy of good enough. They couldn't create a beautiful repair. They couldn't follow proper procedures. They couldn't build something that would pass peacetime inspection, but they could make it watertight. And that was all Yorktown needed. He ordered his men to begin cutting patch plates, not carefully fitted pieces that matched the curves of the hull exactly, but rough rectangles and triangles of thick steel plating. They would overlap the patches, creating what was essentially a crude external bandage over the wound. It wouldn't be elegant, it wouldn't be pretty, but if they could seal it, if they could keep the ocean out, it would be enough. The work began in earnest. Men positioned the first patch plate against the hull, struggling with its weight in the confined space. The welder took his torch and began. The rod glowed white-hot as he dragged it along the edge of the patch. Sparks cascaded down like fireworks, illuminating the dark compartment. The smell of hot metal and burning flux filled the air. Sweat poured down his face despite the ocean breeze coming through the gash in the hull. He worked steadily, methodically, laying bead after bead of weld. This wasn't delicate work. This was brute force welding, heavy beads designed to hold against ocean pressure and the violent motion of a ship in combat. Each pass of the torch consumed inches of welding rod. Each completed section brought them marginally closer to sealing the wound. Other welders joined him, attacking different sections of the patch. The compartment became a hell of sparks and heat. The temperature climbed despite attempts at ventilation. Men worked in short shifts, spelling each other when the heat became unbearable, then returning minutes later to continue the work. The first patch went on, then a second, overlapping the first, then a third. The repair began to take shape, and it was, by any objective standard, ugly. The patches didn't match the hull's curves perfectly. There were gaps that needed to be filled with additional weld. The whole assembly looked rough, improvised, temporary, but it was holding. Pressure tests with water showed minor leaks. The welders attacked these immediately, adding more beads, more reinforcement. They worked through the night, torchlight casting dancing shadows on the bulkheads. Outside, other repair crews were completing their own miracles. Electricians were rewiring damaged circuits. Engineers were patching steam lines. Carpenters were reinforcing weakened decks. The entire ship was being rebuilt around the clock. But the hull patch remained the most critical work. If it failed, if the ocean poured through that wound when Yorktown put to sea, the flooding could doom the ship. The compartments behind the patch were essential to the carrier's buoyancy and stability. Lose them to flooding, and Yorktown would list, would slow, would become vulnerable. In battle, vulnerability meant death. As dawn broke on May 29th, the lead welder stepped back to examine his work. The patch sprawled across the damaged section like a metal quilt, overlapping plates creating a thick barrier between the ocean and the ship's interior. It was reinforced with heavy braces welded into place behind the patch. Additional steel had been added anywhere that seemed weak. The welds themselves were massive, far heavier than peacetime standards would require, but that was by design. This repair had to survive not just ocean pressure, but the violent motion of high-speed maneuvering and the shock of nearby explosions. It looked terrible. There was no other word for it. Navy inspectors would have rejected it out of hand in peacetime. It violated every standard of proper naval architecture. But the welder knew something that architects drawing plans in safe offices could never fully appreciate. Sometimes ugly works. Final tests were conducted. Water was pumped into the compartments behind the patch to simulate flooding. The welds held. Pressure gauges showed no significant leaks. The patch was crude, but it was effective. The welder and his team had done the impossible. They had sealed a catastrophic wound in less than 2 days. Across the rest of Yorktown, similar miracles had occurred. Bomb damage to her flight deck had been patched with steel plating welded directly over the holes. A new section of deck had been fabricated and installed in record time. Her elevators, damaged in the battle, had been repaired and tested. Engineers had rerouted steam lines around damaged sections. Electricians had restored power to critical systems. Carpenters had shored up weakened structures with timber braces that would never pass peacetime inspection, but would hold together long enough for battle. On May 30th, just 3 days after entering Pearl Harbor, USS Yorktown cast off her mooring lines and headed back to sea. Aboard her were air crews who had been fighting since the war began. Her flight deck carried Dauntless dive bombers, Devastator torpedo bombers, and Wildcat fighters. Below decks, her magazines were full, her fuel tanks topped off, her crew at battle stations. And deep in her hull, an ugly patch of overlapping steel plates stood between the Pacific Ocean and the compartments essential to her survival. The welder who had created that patch watched from the dock as Yorktown steamed out of Pearl Harbor. He had no way of knowing if his work would hold, no way of knowing if the carrier would even reach Midway, let alone survive battle. He had done his best, had improvised and adapted and overcome. But now Yorktown's fate was out of his hands. The carrier joined Enterprise and Hornet, forming Task Force 17. They steamed northwest at high speed, racing to reach Midway before the Japanese fleet arrived. Intelligence estimated the enemy would attack on June 4th. The American carriers would be there waiting. Aboard Yorktown, damage control parties monitored the patched sections constantly. Pumps stood ready to handle any leaks. Welders kept their equipment accessible, prepared to make emergency repairs underway if necessary. The ship's officers knew they were steaming into battle aboard a carrier held together by improvisation and willpower. The patch held. Through heavy seas and high-speed maneuvers during the transit, through the stress of continuous operations, the crude repair job performed exactly as needed. The compartments behind the patch remained dry. The welds showed no signs of failure. The ugly patch, created in desperate haste, was proving stronger than it had any right to be. June 4th arrived. Dawn broke over the central Pacific, revealing scattered clouds and moderate seas. Midway Atoll lay quiet, its defenders alert, its aircraft armed and ready, and, approaching from the northwest, the full might of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier-striking force. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were the ships that had struck Pearl Harbor. Their pilots were the most experienced in the Japanese Navy, veterans of campaigns across the Pacific. Their commanders were confident, expecting only token American resistance. Intelligence had told them that Yorktown was still under repair, that only 2 American carriers could possibly be in the area. They were wrong. The Battle of Midway began with Japanese aircraft striking the island. American defenders fought back fiercely, but the enemy's first wave accomplished its mission. The Japanese carriers prepared to launch a second strike to finish off Midway's defenses. Their flight decks were organized chaos, aircraft being rearmed and refueled, ordnance being moved into position. And then American scout planes found them. The radio calls went out, enemy carriers spotted, position, course, and speed transmitted back to the American task force. This was the moment everything had been building toward. The Japanese fleet was vulnerable, their aircraft on the decks being prepared for strikes, their guard temporarily lowered. The American carriers launched everything they had. From Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet, wave after wave of aircraft took to the sky. Dive bombers, torpedo bombers, fighters, every plane that could fly was sent toward the Japanese fleet. The attacks were uncoordinated, each squadron arriving separately, but they kept coming, wave after wave, giving the enemy no respite. The initial torpedo attacks were devastated. The slow, low-flying devastators proved horribly vulnerable to Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Squadron after squadron was torn apart, planes tumbling into the sea, their crews lost. But these attacks drew the Japanese fighters down to low altitude, clearing the sky above the carriers. And then the dive bombers arrived. Dauntless aircraft from Enterprise and Yorktown rolled into their attacks almost simultaneously. They dove from high altitude, pushing through anti-aircraft fire, their pilots selecting targets, their bombardiers tracking the carriers below. The Japanese ships were turning hard, maneuvering frantically, but the American pilots were skilled and determined. Bombs fell. The first hit struck Akagi, Japan's flagship carrier. The bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded among aircraft being rearmed for the next strike. Fuel and ammunition detonated in sympathetic explosions. Fire raced across the hangar deck. Within minutes, the carrier was transformed from a warship into a floating inferno. More hits followed. Kaga took multiple bombs. Her flight deck shattered, her hangar spaces burning. Soryu received bombs that doomed her almost instantly. In the span of 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were transformed from the most powerful striking force in the Pacific into burning wrecks. But Hiryu survived. The 4th Japanese carrier, separated from the others, escaped the initial attack. Her crew launched a counterstrike immediately. Japanese pilots, among the best in their navy, flew toward the American carriers seeking revenge. They found Yorktown. The carrier's radar picked up the incoming raid. Fighter aircraft scrambled to intercept. Anti-aircraft guns trained skyward. Yorktown began violent maneuvering, her captain pushing the ship through turns that stressed every frame and plate, including the ugly hull patch. Below decks, damage control parties felt the ship heel over in violent turns. The forces on the hull increased dramatically. Water pressure on the patch fluctuated as Yorktown's motion pushed her deeper, then raised her in the waves. The welds, created in desperate haste with overlapping plates and heavy beads, faced their first real test. They held. No leaks appeared, no cracks developed in the welds. The patch, for all its crude appearance, was doing its job. The compartments remained dry. Yorktown maintained full maneuverability, and that maneuverability saved lives. The Japanese attack came in hard. Dive bombers and torpedo planes coordinated their strikes, trying to overwhelm Yorktown's defenses. American fighters tore into them, shooting down aircraft before they could attack. Anti-aircraft fire created a curtain of exploding shells around the carrier, but some attackers got through. A bomb hit the flight deck, penetrating deep into the ship before exploding. The blast tore through several decks, starting fires, wounding dozens of sailors. Damage control parties raced to contain the fires and shore up damaged structures. Another bomb near missed, exploding close enough to the hull to cause shock damage. Through it all, the hull patch held. Yorktown's crew fought to save their ship. They contained fires, restored power to damaged sections, jettisoned burning aircraft, and kept the carrier fighting. Within an hour, they had her moving again, capable of launching and recovering aircraft. The ugly patch in her hull had survived bombs, violent maneuvering, and shock from near misses. It continued to perform exactly as needed, keeping the ocean out, maintaining the ship's watertight integrity. But the Japanese weren't finished. Hiryu launched a second strike, more aircraft seeking Yorktown's destruction. Again, the carrier's crew fought back. Again, enemy planes pushed through the defenses. Torpedo hits this time, underwater explosions that tore into the hull on the opposite side from the patched damage. These new wounds, combined with accumulated damage, were too much even for Yorktown's remarkable crew. The carrier began listing. Power failed. She slowed to a stop, dead in the water, her crew struggling to keep her afloat. The captain ordered abandon ship, fearing she would capsize. Hundreds of sailors went over the side, picked up by escorting destroyers, but even then the hull patch held. It wasn't the crude repair that failed Yorktown. It was new damage, accumulated hits in different locations. The welder's work had done everything asked of it and more. Meanwhile, American aircraft from Enterprise had found Hiryu. Dive bombers attacked the last Japanese carrier, hitting her repeatedly, starting fires that would eventually doom her. By evening on June 4th, all 4 Japanese carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were burning or sunk. The United States Navy had won the most decisive naval victory in American history. Yorktown remained afloat, still fighting to survive. Salvage crews returned to the ship, trying to save her. They made progress getting pumps working, controlling flooding, even beginning to restore power. For a day and a half, it seemed possible they might save the carrier. Then a Japanese submarine found her. Torpedoes struck the wounded ship and one of her escorting destroyers. This time, the damage was too much. Yorktown rolled over and sank on June 7th, taking the ugly hull patch down with her to rest on the Pacific floor. But she had accomplished her mission. She had fought at Midway. Her aircraft had struck devastating blows against the Japanese carrier fleet. Her presence, impossible just days before, had helped turn the tide of the Pacific War, and a significant part of her ability to reach and fight at Midway had depended on one welder's crude, ugly, brilliant patch job. The story of that repair spread through Pearl Harbor's shipyards, passed from welder to welder, from repair crew to repair crew. It became a lesson in practical engineering, in the difference between perfect and good enough, in the value of improvisation and innovation under pressure. Naval architects would later study the repair and grudgingly admit its effectiveness. The overlapping patch plates, considered crude by peacetime standards, had actually created a stronger repair than a single fitted plate would have provided. The heavy weld beads, far exceeding normal specifications, had given the joint strength to withstand forces that would have torn apart more delicate work. The bracing behind the patch had distributed stresses effectively. The ugly repair had worked because the welder understood something fundamental. He wasn't building something that needed to last for years or pass perfect inspections. He was building something that needed to work right now, under extreme conditions, for as long as the ship needed to fight. Every decision he made, every crude-looking patch plate, every oversized weld bead served that single purpose. Other ships received similar emergency repairs throughout the war. The lessons learned from Yorktown's rapid refit influenced repair procedures across the Pacific Fleet. Speed and functionality took precedence over perfection. Overlapping patches became standard for emergency hull repairs. Heavy reinforcement was recognized as valuable, even if it added weight. The ugly could be beautiful if it worked. The individual welder's name, lost to most historical records, represents thousands of similar unsung heroes, men who worked in shipyards, repair facilities, and aboard damaged vessels, men who improvised solutions, who adapted procedures, who did whatever was necessary to keep ships fighting. Their work rarely made headlines. Their names didn't appear in battle reports, but their contributions were essential to victory. Consider the mathematics of that repair. In 3 days, Pearl Harbor's workers accomplished what should have taken 3 months. That 30-fold increase in speed made the difference between Yorktown missing Midway entirely and arriving in time to change history. Her aircraft sank or damaged Japanese carriers. Her presence forced enemy commanders to divide their attention. Her sacrifice, when it came, had been meaningful and consequential, and all of it depended on an ugly patch holding back the Pacific Ocean. The welder who created that patch probably never received formal recognition. No medal was struck for emergency hull repairs. No ceremony honored his contribution. He went back to work, took on new assignments, applied the same practical ingenuity to other challenges. Like millions of others during World War II, he did his job, did it well, and moved on. But his work mattered. 3 days of frantic labor, hours of welding in miserable conditions, creating something that looked terrible but functioned perfectly. That work helped win the Battle of Midway, which helped win the Pacific War, which helped end World War II. History often focuses on the dramatic moments, the dive bomber pilots rolling into their attacks, the admirals making crucial decisions, the intelligence officers breaking enemy codes. These deserve recognition, certainly. But victory required thousands of less dramatic contributions. The electrician rewiring damaged circuits, the carpenter shoring up weakened decks, the machinist fabricating replacement parts, the welder creating an ugly but effective patch. The hull patch on Yorktown represents a broader truth about warfare and human achievement. Perfection is often impossible under pressure. Resources are limited. Time is precious. The choice isn't between perfect and imperfect. It's between good enough and failure. The welder understood this instinctively. He looked at an impossible situation and found a possible solution. He worked with what he had, adapted procedures to match circumstances, and created something that served its purpose completely. This principle extends beyond warfare. In any high-pressure situation, whether in combat, business, medicine, or daily life, there comes a point where perfect becomes the enemy of done, where waiting for ideal conditions means missing opportunities, where crude solutions that work outperform elegant solutions that arrive too late. The welder's patch was ugly by peacetime standards. It violated proper procedures. It would never have passed normal inspections. And it worked perfectly for exactly as long as it needed to work. That's not a compromise. That's excellence matched to circumstances. When Yorktown sank, she took with her countless small victories over impossible circumstances. The rewired circuits that kept power flowing, the patched steam lines that maintained propulsion, the reinforced decks that held under stress, and yes, the ugly hull patch that kept the ocean at bay through battle conditions that would have challenged the finest peacetime work. The welder probably thought about his work as Yorktown steamed away from Pearl Harbor, wondered if it would hold, worried about leaks, about weld failures, about the 1,000 things that could go wrong with such a crude repair. He had no way of knowing that his work would become legendary among shipyard workers, no way of knowing that his patch would help win the most important naval battle of the Pacific War. He just did his job. But he did it with skill, with creativity, with an understanding of what truly mattered. Not perfection, but effectiveness. Not beauty, but functionality. Not compliance with regulations, but accomplishment of the mission. The 3 days that transformed Yorktown from a crippled vessel into a fighting carrier represent some of the finest hours in American naval history. Thousands of workers accomplished the impossible through determination, skill, and willingness to innovate. They broke rules when rules didn't serve the mission. They improvised when standard procedures were inadequate. They created ugly solutions that worked instead of perfect solutions that would arrive too late. At the heart of this effort, in a dark compartment below Yorktown's waterline, a welder dragged his torch across steel plate after steel plate, creating an ugly quilt of patches and heavy beads. Sparks illuminated his concentrated face. Sweat soaked his clothes. His arms ached from hours of work, but the weld beads flowed smoothly, building up thickness, creating strength, sealing the wound in Yorktown's hull. That ugly patch saved an aircraft carrier from sinking. It enabled Yorktown to reach Midway in time. It held through violent maneuvering under combat conditions. It performed flawlessly until new damage in different locations overwhelmed the ship. By any measure that matters, it was a perfect repair, regardless of its crude appearance. The Battle of Midway changed the Pacific War. Japan never again achieved strategic initiative. The United States began the long advance that would eventually lead to victory. And among the many factors that contributed to that victory at Midway, one of the most unlikely was an ugly patch of overlapping steel plates welded onto a carrier's hull in desperate haste. The welder never became famous. His name, lost to history for most people, serves as a symbol for all the unnamed contributors to victory, the thousands of ordinary people who did extraordinary work under impossible circumstances, who solved unsolvable problems, who accomplished what experts said couldn't be done. In workshops, shipyards, and repair facilities across the country, similar scenes played out throughout the war. Workers faced damage that seemed beyond repair, deadlines that seemed impossible to meet, requirements that seemed to exceed available resources, and repeatedly they found ways to succeed. They improvised, adapted, and overcame. The ugly hull patch on Yorktown stands as a monument to this spirit of practical problem-solving. It represents the difference between theoretical perfection and practical effectiveness. It demonstrates the value of understanding when rules should be broken and when conventional wisdom should be ignored. Most importantly, it shows what becomes possible when skilled people focus on what truly matters rather than what merely looks good. Today, Yorktown rests on the Pacific floor, nearly 3 miles down. The ugly patch remains attached to her hull, still performing its function of keeping those compartments sealed, even though the ship will never sail again. Deep-sea explorers who have visited the wreck report that the patch is clearly visible, its crude construction apparent even after decades on the ocean bottom. It's a fitting monument. Not beautiful, but effective. Not perfect, but functional. Not celebrated in grand memorials, but essential to victory. Just like the welder who created it, working through the night in a cramped, hot compartment, doing what needed to be done, how it needed to be done, when it needed to be done. The story of one welder's ugly hull patch teaches us that the appearance of work matters far less than its effectiveness. That speed sometimes matters more than perfection. That following every rule can be less important than accomplishing the mission. That ugly can be beautiful when it works. As Yorktown steamed into battle at Midway, she carried the hopes of the United States Navy, the skill of her crew, and the determination of everyone who had worked to make her ready for combat. Deep in her hull, an ugly patch of steel held back the ocean, performing flawlessly, enabling everything else. That patch, created in desperate haste by a welder whose name most people will never know, helped win the Battle of Midway. And the Battle of Midway helped win World War II. From such small, crude, ugly beginnings, great victories emerge. The next time you face an impossible deadline, inadequate resources, or circumstances that seem to demand perfection you can't achieve, remember the welder and his ugly patch. Remember that sometimes good enough, delivered on time, changes history. Remember that functionality beats beauty when survival is at stake. Remember that the perfect can be the enemy of the done. The welder probably never thought his work would be remembered or celebrated. He was just solving a problem, using his skills, doing his job under difficult circumstances. But his ugly patch helped save a carrier, helped win a battle, helped turn the tide of a war. Sometimes the most important contributions come from the most unlikely places. Sometimes the work that changes history looks crude and improvised. Sometimes ugly saves the day. The USS Yorktown proved this at Midway, an aircraft carrier held together by determination, improvisation, and one welder's ugly but brilliant patch job. She fought, she contributed to victory, and when she finally succumbed to accumulated damage, she had already accomplished everything asked of her. The ugly patch had done its job perfectly, and that, in the end, is all that mattered.